So with this symposium, I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to explore the evolution of this field in Canada in terms of both research and practice. In addition, it would be great to hear about what the future possibly holds for this field from a global perspective. Some of my thinking came about when I was at a symposium, about this symposium came about when I was at the World Congress on Active Aging in 2016, and the conference was in Melbourne, Australia, so I had a lot of time on the flight for thinking about this. So first we're going to hear from Dr. Elizabeth Reddy on the history of physical activity and aging research in Canada. Liz is a professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Management. She's a research affiliate with the Health, Leisure, and Human Performance Research Institute and the Centre on Aging at the University of Manitoba. She also serves as the director of the Multidisciplinary Applied Health Sciences PhD program. She obtained her bachelor's and master's degree in physical education at the University of Western Ontario and her PhD in exercise physiology at the University of Western Ontario and her PhD in exercise physiology at the University of Alberta. Her research interests are primarily in the health benefits of physical activity in older adults, ranging from physical function to the broader impact of age-friendly communities. As we heard at the 50th celebration on Thursday evening, Liz was also a pioneering member of the CSEP board as the first woman on the board in the 1980s. Over the years, she has served on many other boards, including CFLRI and the Heart and Stroke Foundation. And I thought I'd also make a specific mention that this might be her last CSEP meeting, as she's retiring in 2018. And so before she begins her talk even, I would like everyone here to help me in congratulating Liz on a long career and her involvement with CSEP. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Michelle. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to our symposium, and thank you, Michelle, for inviting me to present. I'd like to acknowledge, I have a co-author on this presentation. Sarah Clark is the librarian for our faculty at the University of Manitoba, and part of the talk is a bibliometric analysis that we've done on publications in the field in Canada on aging and physical activity. So Sarah was instrumental in actually helping do the search with me. Okay, my part of the talk is basically three parts. Just I'll begin with a very brief setting some context, just looking at Canada in 1967. As Michelle mentioned, there's a lot of anniversaries around 1967, and I think CSEP's 50th anniversary began then, and certainly the Canada's centennial. So I'll just set a little bit of a background around what Canada was like then, because I think the status of research in aging and physical activity is directly related to kind of the context of what was going on in the world and in Canada at that time. Along with that, we'll look a little bit at some of the early recommendations for research around aging, because there wasn't really very much, as you'll see in a minute, being done before the early 70s in Canada around, and probably other places around, physical activity and aging research. I'll just spend a little time on talking about a couple of who I think of as trailblazers, who are some of the early researchers that were instrumental in starting physical activity and aging research in our country. And again, here it's not meant to be inclusive of everybody. There's lots more people that are doing research, certainly early on and now, but I'm trying to highlight a couple of the key people that actually, I think, were instrumental in actually developing a research agenda and focus in this field. And when we get to the third part, which is actually looking at the library analysis, the search that we've done. Some of the more recent researchers will also come to light, because what we've done is we've looked at the time course of when publications in our field began to be more plentiful, and we've also looked a little bit at the topic areas and subject areas of how that kind of grew in terms of the aging interest. It's grown across different areas, and look a little bit at who's been doing much of that research. And actually, Sarah and I are hoping to publish that at some point, because there's a lot more data than what I'm going to share with you today. It was interesting, actually. I really enjoyed being invited to do this. One thing about retiring is I think you get asked to do history things more often when you've been around a long time, and so it's kind of been a very satisfying project for me over the summer. I spent a lot of time reading a lot of aging and physical activity abstracts over the summer. And we'll just finish up at the end. The good news, I suppose, or the bad news, but is that there's still lots of questions that remain. We haven't answered all the questions about the benefits of physical activity and exercise and aging. So we'll just wrap up and look at what some of the more current recommendations are, that what still needs to be addressed. All right, 1967, 50 years ago. Canada was a young country, and I know some people in the room remember 1967, some people probably don't remember 1967. For those of us that were sentient beings, which I was in 1967, Bobby Jimby, the Canada song, I chose this picture just to illustrate all the young people kind of trailing behind Bobby Jimby, and it was, the focus really was on Canada as a young country, and it was, I guess 100 is young for a country, but not for a person maybe, young country and young people. And so if I think back to 1967, we didn't have a silver tsunami, the demographic curve wasn't the same. You really didn't have a lot of emphasis on aging in 1967. Now, I was 14 years old, so maybe I was probably not thinking about aging in 1967, but there was more emphasis on hippies and kind of sort of young people. It was really, really a youth culture, and it was very, very young at that time. Just everybody in the room, I know, is familiar with population pyramids, but it's sort of interesting if you just compare the demographics from 1967, and we hear so much now about the crisis and the baby boomers getting older and the sort of the demographic issues. Well, it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that we have an aging population now, because in a sense, it's, as somebody said, demographics don't happen overnight, they're very predictable. So if you looked at the population in 1967, you could predict what it would be like today if and I think we have a policy discussion later, so the policy people and the planners could actually do a better job probably of predicting what's out there ahead of us. So you can kind of see, I know I was at the bottom of the curve in 1967, and now I'm up in the big lump that's getting older there. Okay, I went back and tried to find first interest in physical activity and aging in research in Canada, and it turns out the first mention that I could find of it actually came from the cardiovascular meetings that were held in Ontario in 1966, and it was a meeting not around aging, but it was around cardiovascular health. And I think a lot of people that moved into physical activity and aging research, some of them came out of the cardiovascular and heart disease research. And so this is a quote from the proceedings of that meeting, which was held in Toronto. Although there is ample evidence that age influences exercise performance, data are not available at present to determine the effect of exercise on aging or rate of aging. So I think that's kind of a neat starting point in that it's sort of a definitive statement that there really isn't, the knowledge wasn't there yet in 1966. The other reason that we began with 1967, true, it is the birth date of CSEP and CAS, but it actually turns out that the aging and physical activity research time course sort of follows the same timeline. So I didn't sort of artificially decide to start at 1967. When you look at the publications and the research that's going on, it actually does start in the late 60s, the early 70s, so it kind of meshes up nicely. I'm sure many of us also that have been around for a while remember the international consensus conferences on physical activity. Well, the first one was exercise, the second one physical activity and health, that were held in Toronto, 1988, 1992. And again, it wasn't all Canadian researchers there, but it was held in Canada, and there was a huge Canadian presence in sort of organizing it and being involved. I chose a quote from Per-Olof Ostrand here because he was at the 1966 cardiovascular meeting, and this sort of quote from him at the beginning of the proceedings for the 88 conference is actually him reflecting back, looking, and it's in the aging chapter in the 88 book, reflecting back to what had changed since 1966. So it's an acknowledgement that there's a dramatic increase in the population of older individuals, and key issues are the extent to which impairment, morbidity, and mortality are inevitable consequences of an individual's genetic composition, and the extent to which environment and the individual's lifestyle pattern can modify these processes. So that's kind of interesting because we see that in all the research as you go forward, is this question of how much of aging is inevitable, it's due to genetics and just due to the actual time course of physical changes with aging, and to what extent, especially for us in physical activity, can interventions in physical activity and exercise actually positively ameliorate some of those losses in function and in mobility with aging. So that was the look back in 88, comparing back to 66. And then Jim Hagberg, again, it's just not necessarily Canadian, but it's from the conference in Toronto. I just pulled this out because it was from the 92 conference, and he's talking about the you would actually probably need long-term clinical trials to look at exercise effect on older training in older individuals, but he said at that point it's probably not very likely. And we know now we do have some long-term trials, but at that point in 25 years ago, it was still not envisioned that they would have these trials would be available. There were two kinds of research in the early research, and we've read these papers where they look at, a lot of papers have looked at taking older, well-trained people or athletes and kind of looking, sort of extrapolating if this is how you look when you're well-trained and older, you could infer that that would mean that you have a training benefit of that. And again, there's probably some problems because you might also infer that you're genetically better endowed and that's why you're there. So it's not the best research design. And then he also mentioned there's a need for, and the benefit of exercise intervention studies in small populations was still a valid research choice. And I think even one of the keynotes yesterday, day before, was talking about there's still a need for, even though randomized controlled trials are really, really the key way to go, but there are some benefits for specific smaller studies as well. So just very briefly before we look at sort of what's been actually happening, the recommendations again from 1992, and you can see these are from the editors were Claude Bouchard, Roy Shepard, and Tom Stevens, so Canadians have put this consensus statement together. Can biological aging be differentiated from secondary aging processes? What are appropriate training prescriptions for the various modes of exercise to promote health, fitness, and functional capacities in different populations of men and women? What factors predispose the elderly to falls? To what extent can improvements in strength and flexibility decrease incidence of falls? And the last one was, is it possible to decrease the rate of decline in fat-free mass in very old subjects? And I think these are really interesting recommendations of gaps of knowledge, because if you look at the research that's happened in the 25 years since then, these are the questions you can see people have been trying to answer these questions, and some of them still remain. I'm going to talk about three locations and three people, I guess, and some of the people that work with them that I consider trailblazers and in really starting physical activity and aging research in Canada. And I know I'm leaving some people out, but I think most people would agree that these are really key people that I'm going to focus on. So everybody probably recognizes Roy Shepard and David Cunningham are the two first people I'll talk about. This really neat side effect of this talk and this process was I had a really nice email correspondence with both David and Roy, and it was very nice. David was on my master's thesis committee, and I was actually in there at Western in 1977, 78 when this whole interest in aging came about. So it's kind of nice to reconnect with David. And Roy, I know through CAS from years ago, not as well as David, but I have to tell you funny, so he's out in BC now, Roy, and he sent me some articles, and this picture was in one of the papers he sent me. He said, well, you have to, we certainly were snappy dressers in the 1970s is what he said, so I appreciated that picture of Roy and David. And this is actually from a bigger picture of the heart health study that was done across Ontario, and that was just wrapping up in the late 1970s. So I think, for me, and I think when you look at the research, really Roy Shepard was really the first person that was doing significant work in this area. Now, he started publishing in 1951, but his first papers in aging and physical activity are kind of in the early 1970s. Well, he has over 80 papers, he has like hundreds and hundreds and thousands of papers, but the over 80 papers are what came up in our bibliometric analysis for our search terms specifically on physical activity, fitness, exercise, and aging in Canada. So he came up with having 80 papers in that search, which was actually, in the overall number of papers is actually the most. I had nice emails back and forth with Roy, and I asked him why he chose to focus, because his background is respiratory physiology, and he was looking at Douglas bags, and his early work was different. And he said he was really became interested in what was the minimum level of fitness needed to maintain independent living. And then some of you know, he's been doing work with Inuit populations and looking at energy expenditure and sort of their physical parameters. And so he said he also wanted to take his studies of the Inuit and actually add an aging component. So that was kind of what he said were the first two reasons, his main reasons for getting into this area of research. Also interesting, because funding's so important, is that he did mention that Health and Welfare Canada at the time had all of a sudden put funding in to try to open up this area of research. So I guess in the early 1970s, there was a realization, you know, looking at that demographic pyramid that we saw, that probably looking to see what kind of things could help people maintain function and independence and reduce disease over time with aging, probably not a bad idea to spend some of our research efforts there. So that's kind of what Roy said, why he got involved. I went through and looked at his papers and sort of tried to pull out what were kind of key papers, and many people that work in the aging field would have read these papers, but I remember his 1978 monograph. I used to have that book. I actually ordered it again. I have it from Amazon. I got an old copy of it from Amazon just when I was doing this talk. But that monograph, 1978, is really a key first book on physical activity and aging. And then together with Ken Sidney, he had some key studies. So the Exercise and Sport Science Reviews are very definitive summaries of the state of knowledge. So he had the one in 1978. So again, early on in the 70s, summarizing effective exercise and aging. And he looked at, he was looking at intensity of physical activity, and he's looking at old people. So basically, he had some key papers around that. Also, prescribing exercise for the very old, which people were afraid to do in those times. I remember reading his papers that basically it wasn't dangerous to do this because people would think exercise was dangerous in those days. And then I put the last one on there just to show you he's still publishing. I mean, and this is one, and he's still publishing in aging, and this is with one of his colleagues, his trainees, Yuki Aogi, went back to Japan, but he's doing longitudinal measures of physical activity and bone health in older Japanese. So he's moved from some of the cardiorespiratory into bone and muscle and sarcopenia. So it's kind of interesting. He's really kept going. It's a long history of he's 1951 to 2017, and he's still going strong. So I just tried to summarize. I mean, you could probably take a whole book, obviously, to summarize what are Roy Shepard's contributions, but I tried to sort of pull out what seemed to be the key things. But certainly, probably the first person to show older adults can adapt to training. And I remember in my lifetime of work, people saying, well, there's not much point in doing a training intervention because you can't really get any benefit at that point. What's the point of intervening? So that was interesting to show that. Moderate and vigorous exercise are safe, or can be safe if for the right people with the right approach. He identified that aerobic fitness is key to maintaining independence in old age. And then, as you can see, he's really gone the gamut, starting off from cardiorespiratory aspects to immune function to sarcopenia, osteopenia. So he's really been engaged across the whole spectrum. The list of people he collaborated with and people that he helped train would be huge, so I didn't try to even do that because I couldn't do that for everybody, but I just wanted to highlight that some of the key people early on was he worked with Terence Kavanagh. His first 1977 paper was with Dr. Kavanagh. Ken Sidney, one of the early students with Dr. Shepard, and went on to his own career and instrumental in many of the publications. Don Patterson, who's here today, began at U of T with Roy Shepard and certainly has gone on. You'll see later, gone on to have a very productive publishing and instrumental career in aging and physical activity at Western Ontario. I mentioned Dr. Aogi, who went back to Japan. So, I mean, I could go on, and I just didn't try to name everybody because then I'd forget somebody. So these are people that were there early on I'm trying to mention here. Okay, now Dr. David Cunningham at Western Ontario was also, I think, really early on involved in physical activity and aging research, and I had nice correspondence with him around his sort of early interest and motivation. And as I said, it sort of coincided with the time that I was at Western, so it was interesting because I can remember some of these things going on. But in 1978, he had completed that multi-center exercise and heart disease study, which was really a key study in physical activity, and it was across different sites in Ontario. And said he was looking for a new focus for his research. He began a retirement study with Peter Reckner, who was a cardiologist, so I also had learned this through this process. He passed away, unfortunately, last spring. I hadn't realized that till I started doing this research. And John Howard from the business school. So they began a longitudinal retirement study. Again, funding comes into it, so funding is always key, right? So he actually got some NSERC funding looking at exercise responses of men and women 70 plus, began a longitudinal study, and then he actually wrote the proposal to establish the Canadian Centre for Activity and Aging at Western in 1989. Lots of publications. You can see some of the other key people here with publications, but certainly looking at training responses, self-selected walking pace. So some of the work on recognizing that somebody's walking pace is very much related to their health and function, and so looking at changes in that with aging. the retirement study, and then, again, determinants of independence in the elderly. So these are all key areas that you can see we're starting to get some answers to some of those questions that were posed in 1966 and 88. Again, hard to summarize what the contributions are, but I tried to sort of see what would be some of the unique things that David and his colleagues contributed early on. So some of the first large training studies of cardiovascular responses of older adults with exercise, demonstrated the importance of self-paced walking and aerobic fitness to maintaining late life independence, and established the Canadian Centre for Activity and Aging. And having that's been key because, in a sense, there's training, so there are younger researchers and graduate students, and people can actually train to maintain interest in this area, getting able to help get funding for people, and then also development and delivery of evidence-based programs, so like putting together the theory and the practice. And again, lots of people, it's not any extensive list, but certainly early work with Peter Recknitzer and John Howard. Joan Bassey, who I went to spend some time with in Nottingham years ago looking at aging, but David and Peter went to see her lab at Nottingham, and that's kind of came back with some ideas for the training studies. Certainly Don Patterson again, and then some of the students, Scott Thomas, Joan Hyman, Larry Wolf, Charles Bryce is now there. So there's been a lot of people at Western, and they go on and on. Again, I started to stop at just more early people. Just briefly, Dr. McComas, I didn't know Dr. McComas, but everything was cardiorespiratory pretty much up to this point. And then at McMaster, Dr. McComas was working on changes in muscle. And so some of the early work there was more, not so much physical activity and exercise part, but the actual the physiology of aging. And some of the key papers and some of the students that worked with Dr. McComas were, so Tony Vandervoort, who's at Western, he went to Western after, had a very key study in the mid-'80s, then strength and endurance of skeletal muscle in elderly. And Audrey Hicks is here, Neil McCartney and colleagues who had worked with Dr. McComas earlier. This is still a really, really highly cited study, one of the first sort of long-term resistance training studies. So again, it shows the movement into neuromuscular emphasis. 1987 Globe and Mail article, so more interest in recognition that aging and exercise is important. Okay, I just want to, I guess about 10 minutes or so left, is that okay? To talk a little bit about the bibliometric analysis. We use Scopus, which I gather gave us the broadest look at articles of papers. It went to behavioral and the physiology. 1963 to 2016. 63, I didn't set that. That's just when the first paper popped up with our search terms. We looked at articles and reviews only. We only looked at English, mostly because not particularly fluent in French. Most of them were in English. I think this could be done again in Canada with French research. I would recommend it gets done again. We looked at keywords, titles, and abstracts. Our 3 physical activity terms were everything around physical activity, fitness, and exercise were kind of the 3 terms. We had 7 different terms for older adults and seniors and geriatrics and aging. We kind of had a bunch of terms there. Canada was, by research, one of the authors at least had to be affiliated with the Canadian institution. So we got 2,700 articles. After review, which was a lot of my summer, we eliminated 1,200 of them. I read all the abstracts, which was really interesting. I really enjoyed doing it, actually. So the hardest part was what to exclude, because we wanted to have physical activity, exercise, fitness, and aging. So some were like purely clinical or treatment that weren't really, they were just basically exercises, sort of fixing your broken elbow or something. We kind of got rid of those. Psychosocial that were behavioral and applied to physical activity participation and programs we kept in, but if it was just pure theory, we didn't keep them in. If it was very much biomechanical, purely biomechanics of something, we didn't keep it in. And disease and chronic conditions is in, but when physical activity and exercise wasn't the main focus, so they might have just used a fitness or exercise test, but it was very, very sidelined. It was just not really the focus of the study at all. We kind of took those out as well. We had 1,469 papers left at the end, which is kind of cool, done by Canadian researchers. I thought what was really neat is they were in 450 journals. Like, I was really, really surprised to see that many journals, and that was pretty neat. And then we did some further analysis on the 150 that were most highly cited papers, because we couldn't really do all the analysis on 1,400. The Mueller paper at the bottom was a bibliometric analysis that was done in the States last year, published. They used Web of Science, and they got 9,000 papers. There's only, in their top 45 they analyzed again, only one was Canadian, which is really, I thought, where's our Canadian papers? And it was Don and Darren Warburton's paper for these physical activity guidelines, 2010 paper. Okay, so here's our 1,400 papers. Interesting, the first one was 1963, a few in the 70s, and it's kind of interesting. I thought they would go up earlier, but it wasn't until after sort of 1990, 2000 that you started to see a real increase in publications by Canadian authors or in the field. The first paper was somebody that I didn't know, but he actually just passed away. He was at UBC, he was in the anatomy department, and he was looking at the effect of vasopressin and aldosterone on the distribution of water, sodium, and potassium on work performance in old rats. So in terms of our search terms, that was the first paper that came up, 1963, Dr. Friedman. The journals this is for all for our 1,469 papers. We kind of looked at which were the most commonly published in journals. And Journal of Aging and Physical Activity, Human Kinetics Journal had the most publications. MSSE, our own APNM kind of was third for Canadian publications, and you can kind of see some of their gerontology, some are more physiology journals. And then we also looked at the top journals by citations. So, and again, it flips around a little bit because some of the more higher impact factors journals pop up here. So the JAP comes up first. So it had, in terms of the most citations of the 1,400 articles that had the most citations were in that. And some of the ones with the asterisks are just journals that didn't come up in the top numbers of publications, but they're kind of new to this list. They just came up by having significant articles that were cited most. And again, they probably have a higher impact factor. So Canadian Medical Association Journal, Muscle and Nerve. So these journals popped up in the citation list. The most cited papers was interesting. 6-minute walk, a new measure of exercise capacity in patients with chronic heart failure. It had 1,300 citations, and it was from a group at McMaster, Dr. Guyat, and it was from Clinical Epidemiology and Biostatistics, and it was in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. The top 150, about half of them were experiments, like whether they were RCTs or whether they were basic experimental design. Almost half were review papers. We kept review papers in just to see what was going on. Cross-sectional was quite popular. There were some longitudinal studies. VAL means like validation, kind of validation measurement studies. Position stands was pause, and then there was one qualitative paper came up. We had one qualitative paper stayed in, which is interesting. The research fields early on, so down at the bottom, purple and green, sort of responses are pure physiological response to exercise and aging. So we started off in the 70s, and it's probably some of the stuff at Toronto and Western. Physiological response was early on. The green papers are measurement, studies around designing measurements was early. And then there's more papers. The purple ones are, as I said, response physiology. There's common right through. Then we get into the physical activity levels and guidelines, light blue. There's very few about those later. They come later on. Participation is the behavioral physical activity factors that affect people's participation with aging and physical activity came later on as well. And health, if it was purely a physiological response, I kept it as physiology response. But if it was more about implications for health, I called it health. That was the hardest distinction. And you can see the health papers became much greater later on as well. The emphasis, kind of the sort of area, early on, cardiovascular, respiratory, blood, and I actually put the immune system in there. I couldn't fit it on there, but the immune system I considered in there, and they were earlier on. Muscle, bone, and nerve. I didn't write nerve, but neural is also there, so muscle, bone, and neuromuscular are the red, and they came a little bit later. And then you can see things like behavioral is purple, so it came a bit later, the behavioral studies. The cognitive studies are green. There's lots of studies recently on cognitive impacts. And then applied are things that are multifactorial. So it's like a lot of the Falls studies are looking at effects on cognition, effects on function, effects on the physiology. So some of the applied ones, which again came later, are kind of the more ones that are multifactorial benefits of exercise effects in older people. Okay, I'm glad to see Don Patterson here, so I can show him that Don, in our most cited 150 papers, Don actually had the most of those. So this was really interesting to see that. Neil McCartney, David, Mark Tomaposky, Tony Vandervoort, Teresa, Lee Ambrose, Roy Shepard, Audrey Hicks is here as well, Kareem Khan, Ken Rotwick, and Stu Phillips was also at the conference. So basically that's who, in our 150 most cited papers, that's who had the most of those papers. Not surprising, given, I guess, the people that were doing all the research. So this is the universities that actually had also the most. These are just on the 150 most cited papers. And just in conclusion, then, just to wrap up, because we're out of time, but so just the first slide will be what we currently know then. So now I showed you what the questions were in 66 and 88. So we now have evidence, and there's a couple of references that kind of I pulled this together, which is a summary of where we are. The ability of regular physical activity to lessen or prevent physiological decline with aging, we know that. We know that the efficacy of physical activity improving function as a later life intervention in older adults, and it's about 50% less relative risk of some of these functional declines, we know that. There's an association between physical activity and biomarkers of aging. For example, telomeres has been studied. We know there's a reduced all-cause mortality risk and enhanced disease prevention with physical activity in older adults, like there is in other people. And we know that physical activity reduces risks of falls and improves cognition in older adults. So these are some of the things. There's still questions around that, but we know this. The questions mostly remain in again, these are 3 papers, and the Hughes article was looking at current status of physical activity research. The cellular and molecular mechanisms underlying the benefits of regular physical activity on physiological function with aging are still not completely understood. Research recommendations should focus on better understanding of health outcomes from resistance and balance training. That came up a lot in the recommendations. There's still need for more look at dose-response relationships in physical activity and aging. And then best practice strategies, again, going to practice, must be identified to promote physical activity among both community dwelling, and there's more with them, but frail older adults and sort of institutionally residing adults, there's less recommendations for them still. So I'd just like to, again, thank everybody for coming this morning and acknowledge David Cunningham and Roy Shepard for their support for me in sending me materials. Certainly Don Patterson also sent me some information, as did Charles Rice, so thank you to Don and Charles. Thank you, Michelle, for inviting me, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.